Okay, thank you. So can everyone see my screen? Yes, good. I always check that when I'm teaching. No, it's just great. It's great to be invited here. I think this workshop is on such an important topic. And I think that Dr. Wilson's talk really set the stage well for what I want to talk about. What I want to do is kind of focus down on what's happening right now in terms of COVID-19 and some of the very, very specific problems that we're having. And I think that, in the discussion, then we can come back to Dr. Wilson's solutions, right? And see, many of them could address some of these problems, but I'm going to just give some kind of framework for that. So just give you a little bit of background. I mean, all of this is well known now, but certainly stores, factories, many other businesses have closed, right? Because of the policy mandates, the downward demand shifts from consumers being worried about health. All of these things have happened during the pandemic. What's not well known, though, is what were the effects of COVID-19 on small businesses. We have some data, but it's interesting that it's not more complete. And certainly information on sales, is all mentioned in a second, is also very incomplete. So what I've kind of started out doing at the very beginning of COVID is I set up a research agenda where I tried to track what was happening in the US economy, especially for small business owners. And one of the issues that I was really interested in is what happened, like in April, May, June, in the early stages of it, and how was the rebound affecting small business owners. So I've been tracking that the entire time, and I'll show you some information on that. The second thing is that there's a lot of concern that there were disproportionate impacts, especially on minority-owned businesses. And so I'm going to show you some information on that also. Then the sales part of it is another one that's much harder to get data on. And so I was able to get some information specifically for California on this and what happened in the early stages. But you'll see that that information is a little more limited. I'm actually trying to get more access to data on that to look at it more carefully. And then also what types of businesses were hit the hardest, and how is all of this compared to online sales, as we know is really increased over this period of time. So the timeline of the pandemic, I don't need to go through this too carefully because we've kind of celebrated the 1-year anniversary of all of this. San Francisco Bay Area was one of the first places to impose shelter-in-place restrictions to stop the spread of the disease. The state of California followed. New York State was the next state to follow. And then by early April is the key here. Most states imposed some kind of social distancing restrictions. So here's what happened. So this is the number of active business owners. So these are business owners in the US who report that they've been actively running their business that week during the survey week. And the data come from the current population survey, which is the Bureau of Labor Statistics data that tracks the unemployment rate. So these are, a very credible source of data, and I've used them in a lot of research projects. So you can see kind of over time from 2005, you can see the effects of the Great Recession. There was a downward dip. It turns out that that downward dip in active business ownership was only 5% through the Great Recession. And then all of a sudden, April 2020 comes in and we see a 22% drop in the percent of business owners who were active. So of course, the pandemic had a huge effect in that first month. It was felt disproportionately. I noticed that Dr. Wilson was citing some of my numbers. So the Black-owned businesses, were hit the hardest, right? And that came out a lot in the news. And, there were policymakers citing this number. And what I've heard is that it actually had a real big impact on the second round of the PPP program in terms of really, creating awareness about this problem. But you can see for African-American business owners, that was was hit by 41%. So this huge shutdown in April. Latinx businesses were also hit extremely hard, so a 32% drop. And then Asian-owned businesses were also hit really hard during this period of time. Has there been a rebound since April? Yes, of course. There's been a steady month-to-month rebound all the way to October 2020. So every month, business owners were becoming more active, like in terms of restarting their business or operating their business again. That kind of rebound is pretty consistent across racial groups. So for some reason, this didn't transfer over, but the far left is, it's the same order. So this is for Black-owned businesses, the middle one is for Latinx businesses, and the third one is for Asian American-owned businesses. And so there was pretty much steady improvement. One thing that has been kind of an interesting question and I've talked to a few reporters about this recently, is that Asian American businesses have not recovered entirely after the pandemic. And so there's a lot of concern right now about kind of discrimination and about the types of businesses that Asian Americans own that haven't reopened are often in these kind of real small scale services that have a lot of person-to-person contact. What has happened since? It's very interesting, but we have not had a complete rebound. What has happened is in November and December, as cases of COVID kind of flared up, we've seen kind of a decline in business owner activity that's kind of continued through to January. And now it seems to have flattened out finally and recovered a little bit. But there definitely was this kind of second downward hit to active business ownership that happened in November and December of 2020. Now, turning to sales, all of the data that I've shown you is just whether or not the owner is actively running their business. It doesn't tell us how much was lost in sales, and presumably there were huge losses in sales, right? Even if you were still running your business, you might have been running it at 40, 50 hours a week before the pandemic, and then you're down to 10 to 20 hours a week. That's a huge loss in terms of how much you can earn from your business. That data is a lot harder to get. So what I did is I turned to California data and was able to get some information on this from the California Department of Tax and Revenue. And so what I did is I looked at average sales losses in the second quarter of 2020. So that would be April, May, and June. And so here you see this huge drop. It was a 15% drop. Normally what's happening is quarter to quarter in California, you're growing by 3 to 4%. And instead, that first quarter, we saw a drop of 15%. Now, of course, it rebounded pretty quickly after that, but those are large income losses to all of these business owners in California. And of course, it's not distributed evenly at all by sector. So here, if you look to the far left, one of the sectors that got hit the hardest was accommodations, right? So hotels lost nearly 90% in their sales in that first quarter. Restaurants, full service restaurants especially, were hit extremely hard. Bookstores, gift novelty stores, gasoline stations were another one that was surprisingly hit really hard, right? As people stopped to commute. Now look to the far right. What you see is this one huge outlier. Turns out that a big part of that outlier is online sales. And so what we've seen is this big shift to people purchasing things online. Now, where are they purchasing those online? Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get that in my data, but of course we know that a lot of that was towards, bigger online stores or big box stores that have well-defined web pages. So what can we do to move forward? I've actually testified in front of the House of Representatives making some of these recommendations. I think the number one issue or number one thing that's going to help small businesses is the vaccine, right? I think once consumers feel safe, there's going to be a fair amount of pent-up demand. People are going to want to go back to restaurants. They're anxious to go back. They're anxious to go to shops. And so I think that's sort of our number one kind of solution to kind of move forward and help small businesses fully recover in terms of their sales, their lost business activity, and their employees that they hire. But there is another angle to this that I think is extremely important, and this builds on what we're talking about today, is there has been an extensive shift to online shopping. I mean, I've noticed this personally. My mother, who's much more, elderly, has never been comfortable purchasing things online. And now all of a sudden she's buying everything online. And I think that is not an anecdotal story, one person's story. I think that we've seen that across the country. People are just much more used to shopping online. They're more comfortable with it. They enjoy doing it. And so this is a trend that was happening before the pandemic, but the pandemic has extremely accelerated it. And it's not going to go away. I don't think, even with pent-up demand, people want to go back to restaurants and shops. There still would be a lot more purchasing online. And so the problem is that small businesses don't have a huge presence online. So one thing that the government could do is try to provide some more aid directly in the form of web page assistance to make that much more available, to make it much lower cost. We could subsidize that. We could subsidize that directly as a targeted benefit. And I think that there will be a lot of, there should be a fair amount of political support for it. Clearly, access broadband. Access to internet connections is, is key, is essential here. Another thing is that search engines often prioritize, big box stores, or the ones that are paying ads, or, other kind of search routines. But what if, at least for now, to recover from this, they just prioritize local small businesses, that was like their #1 priority, was to make, these businesses show up first, to make that very relevant to consumers, that, hey, I need to support my local businesses. Those dollars stay in my community. Those dollars hire other workers in my community. That's extremely important. It's important for reducing inequality. It's important for keeping that money locally instead of having it go to, kind of central areas where we see these warehouses where, many fewer people live. Okay, so that's all I wanted to kind of talk about in my talk. Obviously, we have time for questions. If you want to look at some of the research that I've done, I have a couple of papers here, but also at the very bottom, I noted this ongoing small business activity tracking. I am planning on continuing this, at least for another year. And so if you want to look at the latest data available, I keep updating that. Usually I update it about every other month, and you can see the latest data. And I include it for all major ethnic and racial groups, for immigrants. So there's a lot of detail there. It's not just showing the total numbers for the US, but if you're really interested in small business owners, and again, the data are from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. What I'm doing is I'm compiling them and creating a way that you can read them.